the only way I see it working is if owning an esports team is like in traditional sports, someone who's extremely rich and they find it fun in managing the team. And so you're not expecting it to be profitable. You're expecting to get some fun out of it, similar to what F1 is. Hi friends, welcome to the Naavik Gaming Roundtable. This is the one podcast to stay up to date with all the latest game business news. And today I'm joined by Aaron Bush, co-founder of Naavik, Tammy Levy, Chief Games Officer at Captain TV, and David Kaye, who is going to self-intro.
Hi, yes, I am presently the president of Snapshot Games, which is a 75-person PC and console game studio based in LA and Sofia, Bulgaria. We were acquired by Embracer in 2020, so we're part of the behemoth over there. I've spent most of my career over the past couple decades building game companies, mostly as a founder. First game I worked on, I started out as a game designer. I was actually one of the first free-to-play games, which was a text mud called Kaye, still running today. Across my career, I've worked on social games, mobile games, console, and PC games. So yeah, excited to be here.
Yeah, thanks for being here. That is a long list of accomplishments in gaming.
I've been knocking around for a while.
Cool. And Tammy, I hear you also have some good news. Captain TV announced a new game.
Yes, we announced the game that I've been primarily focused on called Nitro Stream Racing. We went into closed alpha last week, and kind of for context, what we're building over here at Captain TV is a new genre of games for streamers and their communities to play together. Our games really are designed from the foundation to think about streamer and audience interactivity. So Nitro is a racing game, a car racing game. The tagline is a mouthful, but it's a high-speed, streamer-hosted, chat-plays racing game. So What does that mean? That means that you can go to Twitch and look for a streamer that is playing Nitro, watch and follow their stream, and the way that you engage and participate in the races is by simply entering !play in chat. That gets you into race. We have slight interactivity there where you can just fire up boosts and stuff to create chaos during the race. We also have kind of a companion website on playnitro.com to do a little bit more customization, and we're going to add a metagame layer to your card progression, your character progression, but it's really fun, chaotic, and it's pure mayhem when you watch these races. What's really cool is that we were also able to really partner with content creators of all sizes, from Ludwig, if people are familiar with that name, Nornline, who's very much in game review type content creation. Quarter Jade, she plays a lot of Valorant, so kind of hitting different segments of the big streamers, and then hundreds of streamers from our own community that have already been able to grow their communities with some of our other games. So It's very exciting, and
it is.
The game looks gorgeous. So we're very. It is very fun. So we're very excited.
I actually watched one of the streams. It was chaos. It was personified. It was actually really fun, just seeing the cars all fall off a cliff and explosions happening. Cool. Well, congratulations. I hope the launch goes well. And we're going to jump into the roundtable discussion. So today we're going to be reviewing Microsoft and EA's earnings. It's our favorite season to do some earnings analysis. We're going to check the profit pulse of eSports, dive into some news that have been banging around there. And also, if we have some time, we'll try to complete last week's Playtika discussion with their latest Web3 announcement, because it came in the day after we recorded. So we're here to catch up. All right, Tammy. What's up with Metacore?
Yeah, so next update here is Metacore acquiring Supercell's Everdale, and this was announced this last week. There were no details really about the deal in terms of what the structure looks like, what the cost was. But I think what's really interesting about this is that second chances are so rare in game dev. Like we launch games, they don't hit whatever targets a specific company has, and we just shut down games, and it's very hard to do that. So it's a very interesting case study almost that we'll be able to analyze and on whether Metacore can take this baseline and an IP that Supercell developed with Everdale and kind of relaunch it and build it back up based on what Supercell learned from their soft launch with Everdale. What's true is that what's a good business for one company, say Supercell that makes hundreds of millions of dollars a year, is very different. Like just like the expectations and your gates to turn it into a successful business is very different from that to someone like Metacore that they're starting to build their portfolio of games. They have talked about like they've outlined their portfolio strategy where they want to focus on more than just one game, hit multiple genres. And right now they only have Merge Match, which makes 50 million around 50 million a year, which is a great business, right? But it's just like scales are very different. So it'll be very interesting to see what happens here. I think what's the last point I'll make here is that what is really interesting as well is that Supercell has invested in Metacore. So there's also kind of like an added layer there to this deal because Metacore is part of Supercell's portfolio of studios. And the studios that they've invested into. So they received, 15 million euro in funding in 2020, and then a line of credit in 2021 for like 150 million euro. So for Supercell, Metacore's success is their success as well. So you kind of can start gleaning a little bit of like, the game probably had some really good and positive traction, but just not at the level that Supercell would want to invest their own team into, but worth doing kind of like another take on the game. I don't know if you have any additional thoughts on this.
Yeah, I didn't fully understand. So did Metacore acquire the game from Supercell? Because from what I read, it seemed like they took on the Mantle, but that there wasn't really a financial transaction.
So there's no details about whether there was like a financial transaction, what kind of like deal it is. It's just Metacore has taken over the game from Supercell. So we don't really have any confirmation. It could be like a publishing agreement. It could be just them taking it over for free. Like we don't really have any confirmation or any details on that front.
Yeah.
But I do think like it's probably a whatever type of structure it is a sweetheart structure just from being part of that Supercell portfolio of companies.
It's a no-brainer for Supercell, right? Just from the standpoint of like, oh, you weren't going to do this thing, so you can whatever the financial terms are, it's better than zero, right? And so from them, I mean, I think it's a better outcome than it would have been. I will say I'm a little skeptical that this is going to really turn out to be a great win for Metacore. And I could be totally wrong, but when you look at Everdale itself, what made it unique was that it optimized for a large number of player check-ins rather than a large amount of time spent playing. And Herschel, who wrote a deconstruction of this for Naavik Pro several months ago, he noted that it's just not clear that prioritizing like number of check-ins over like how much time people actually spend in the game like can lead to a workable business model. Like there was no sign of that really working at the time. And so
I'm gonna make a bold guess here, prediction.
Okay.
But my prediction is that what Metacore is going to bet into is completely revamp of the systems.
Yeah.
And they take the art, the charm, which is what people were excited about, like the idea of like this very charming farming game that we haven't seen in a while, and go a little bit like a completely different route in terms of game systems and potentially like go more traditional like farming type game. So that would be my guess on where, if Everdale ends up being a success, where it ends up in lands.
I really support that prediction because Metacore is expert at building strong metagames. They even state that the core gameplay is less important than building a really strong metagame. And so I think they have the freedom to change that. We've seen that with Merge Mansions. They've created this whole new type of cinematic, high quality ads for the game that tell a story. And like there's a massive amount of lore. And the ads granny has just become a cultural thing for people who watch ads in games. And then additional to that, I also see how, looking at Merge Mansion's KPIs, how they're unlocking new countries and how they're being able to scale. I think I'm more bullish than you, Aaron. I'll side with Tammy here.
No, I think I probably agree with that prediction. I don't think the game as it was is the future of where this is going. But of course, anytime you really have to rebuild a game from scratch, you also increase the risk, I think.
True.
So I don't know. Yeah, not an easy layup, I think, but I guess we'll see.
Yeah, Metacore doesn't have an easy feat here, but it'll be interesting to see where they land with Everdale. They also haven't promised that it will work out. So
yeah, exactly.
Like, we'll see if this works out. So.
Well, yeah, look forward to seeing what happens there. And then on to the next update, PS VR2 / sales expectations. So in the last couple of roundtables, we assessed that the market for VR is actually still really in early adoption. And that would continue to be the case for PlayStation's VR2 system. And yeah, they reportedly reduced the sales projections for the launch after receiving fewer pre-orders than expected. If you try to buy one now, there's no waiting list. It was also reported that they actually slashed production, but Sony came out and refuted that. They have not slashed production numbers. Additionally, so the reasons that seem pointing to the low number of sales than expected is that the price point is higher than buying a PlayStation, which is something that we addressed, and also the lack of compatibility with other platforms. Because if you acquire, for example, a MetaQuest, you can play that across multiple platforms and systems, but not the PlayStation.
Yeah, we largely called that. David, I'm curious on the bull-bear spectrum of VR, where do you fall on this?
It's really tough. The history of the games industry, the expansion of the games industry has really been reducing friction has allowed new customers to enter the market. And I think the problem with VR still, and it's been kind of caught in this trap for a long time now, is the friction is still just too high. And there's friction on multiple dimensions. It's friction in terms of the price of entry, which is clearly hurting their adoption. And there's a lot of friction around the user experience, of course. And so VR is still, I think, trapped in this chicken and egg of it's a very high friction thing, which means that developers are not highly incentivized to develop for it. And so adoption is slower because there's no content that's really the kind of killer app that drives a huge amount of adoption. So I don't know. I think I think what we're all still waiting for, and maybe Meta is going to deliver this to us at the back end of tens of billions of dollars more of hardware R&D, is a device which has the low friction of an entry price that people will pay, but also as low friction as a user experience, so that it can find a space in people's day-to-day in the way that other devices that have massive adoption have done. So until that happens, I think VR is kind of stuck in the same place.
Yeah, I think that's well said. I just want to give a shout out. Matthew Ball, he wrote a recent essay called Why VR AR Gets Farther Away as It Comes into Focus. It was a really good read, and I think sums up kind of the state of this industry really well. And a lot of it echoes what David was just saying. Where basically like the challenge is you need essentially a computer that's more powerful than your computer into a compact thing that goes on your head. And that's just like an enormously challenging thing to do that, yes, takes tens of billions in R&D to figure out. So yeah, super fascinating. But yeah, with PlayStation, not a surprise. We kind of called it, not specifically that they'd cut sales so soon, but that it wouldn't be a huge hit.
I wish I could say we're moving on to happier lands, but unfortunately we are not. Aaron,
it's only getting worse.
EA.
Yeah, let me pull up my notes real fast. So EA just reported its quarterly results, and I won't dig into all the numbers here, which many people found underperforming, but the main headline is that EA is shutting down Apex Legends Mobile, is shutting down Industrial Toys, which includes canceling the upcoming Battlefield Mobile game, and this is resulting in layoffs. So a bunch of pretty bad news here. And first of all, our thoughts go out to everyone who is affected by these layoffs and is seeing their hard work get shut down. That's always tough to see and go through. But I mean, in general, when looking at EA, this is just another big step back for EA Mobile, which has been struggling forever to acquire, build, partner, manage, and grow a successful mobile business. And we did kind of see the writing on the wall with Apex Legends Mobile. And while the game is really good, it won awards and genuinely is one of my favorite mobile games. We did recognize that as a revenue driver, it was pretty clearly underperforming, which is also something that in my opinion, EA leadership failed to be super transparent about with investors too. And I can't speak too much to Industrial Toys and Battlefield Mobile, especially since Battlefield Mobile hadn't fully launched yet. But it seems like the so-called lessons learned from Apex are being extrapolated to Battlefield 2. And with Apex, what's weird is that management in the earnings call said that they, quote, have plans to reimagine a connected Apex mobile experience in the future, end quote. So I guess we'll eventually see what that means, but it also makes me wonder if they want to reset or abandon partner relationships and bring everything together more in-house and in a more specific cross-platform kind of way that connects the games more so. Apex Mobile was co-developed with Tencent, and it's just interesting because Call of Duty is sort of going through the same thing, building a new fully owned mobile Warzone game that will compete with Call of Duty Mobile, which is also co-developed by Tencent. And maybe if Warzone is deemed successful, Activision will want to consolidate its Call of Duty mobile efforts there too. So in general, I feel like we're seeing the pendulum swing from heavily relying on co-development partners for these kinds of games back to building more in-house with greater emphasis on cross-platform connections. I don't know if it'll work. It's purely an execution question, but that's what I think we're seeing in these two cases at least. So, anyways, tough day for EA Mobile, and we'll see where these franchises go next.
Yes, I think so. I believe Battlefield was already being soft launched in a handful of countries, so they could have seen the beginning of KPIs that were not promising, and they did specify that Apex being a standalone game that had no connection to the very successful console game, that you have a battle pass and those are not connected. And then we look at what Call of Duty Warzone is planning on doing, which it's not a cross play where you're multiplayer with someone who's on console, for example, but it's a single battle pass, an item you get in mobile. You can then go home and use that item in console. It's just like this interconnected experience. And I believe at the end of the day, I feel like EA is making the right call here of not trying to pursue Battlefield that's following the same model of Apex, especially with such a massive competitor like Warzone landing into the market this year. We'll have to see. Well, I'm really curious to see if EA is going to pick up these mobile games, change them around, and try to release them again. I'm not entirely sure based on how
Yeah.
leadership has connected with mobile in their previous earnings.
Yeah, I think they'll need another big reset in EA Mobile. Is the way I see it. It's just been really hard. The more interesting question that's not even about EA to me is just what is Activision going to do with Call of Duty on mobile? Like, if Warzone works, are they going to shut down Call of Duty Mobile and funnel
They have
everything?
stated that they have stated that they will not shut down Call of Duty Mobile.
Like, I can understand wanting to rely less on like partners, but I don't know. It's weird.
Okay, we'll jump into the next earnings, which is Microsoft with David.
All right, here we go. So for the 3 months ending 31st of December of last year, the gaming segment was about $4.7 billion of revenue, which was a 13% decline from the prior year. It's been a tough. I think the comps versus 2021 have been tough for the games industry across the board. I think it's driven by a few things. Obviously, you're comparing it with a pandemic year where engagement and revenue across all kinds of digital sectors was obviously much higher. I think it's compounded by the relative paucity of high-profile releases on console in 2022, so I just sort of don't overly read into that. But there are a few things that are before I go on, curious to hear your take on the top line.
Sure. I mean, I guess from my point of view, it's not too surprising. The software part being down in particular is not too surprising because it just kind of reflects the fact that their first party titles have been lackluster, and third party, like all around console, the past few months has been more lacking, just like in 2022 with fewer releases and such. The part that stands out the most to me is maybe a bit more concerning is the hardware side. Just seeing how much that has fallen so early in the console cycle, where probably, if all supply chain issues are solved, PlayStation would see the opposite of that. They'd be seeing more growth versus decline. And so yeah, that stands out to me as maybe a bit more concerning when you kind of look at that. And then Game Pass as like the only piece of the puzzle that really is growing maybe isn't too surprising. But yeah, the hardware piece is more the line that popped out most to me this time around.
I agree. It certainly would be a source of concern to me to see declining hardware sales. I think we're now 2 years past the launch of the new generation. So I agree. I would be still expecting hardware sales to be growing. I wonder whether there is a sort of the success of. I think Microsoft has a very interesting strategy in games, right? And I think Game Pass is really worth examining quite closely. It's been, if you compare PS Plus to Game Pass, Game Pass has fewer subscribers. I think Game Pass now has somewhere between 25 and 30 million subscribers, depending on kind of where you get your information from. PS Plus is actually more like 45 million as of the last quarterly report. But PS Plus has actually been declining where Game Pass is still growing. And I think that there is a degree to which, if you look at the long term, I think that Microsoft is, if I was making a long-term bet on the success of either strategy, I do think that what Microsoft is doing with Game Pass is really powerful. I think it's also notable, if you look at the last few quarterly earnings, it is notable that they've made several comments over the past 2, 3, 4 earnings calls that so there have been some declines actually in third-party software sales in the Xbox marketplace, but all of that has been more than offset by the growth in Game Pass, which tells me that they are being very successful in creating a a real magnet for people's time, attention, and money in Game Pass. And I think it's going to be, and the more successful they are with that, and as they continue to grow across platforms beyond the actual Xbox hardware, I think the relative importance of hardware sales, which are low to negative margin, usually this early in the life cycle, I think that the hardware becomes a less important piece of the puzzle.
Yeah, I think it's the hardware piece is a very interesting point. I think it's worth not kind of undermining the supply chain issues, because that has definitely hit a lot. We've seen kind of those ripple effects just keep resonating throughout sales in general. But I think that there's also the element of content and hardware kind of working in tandem to sell, exclusives and like big launches, drive also the desire for hardware and buying the console. And we didn't really see that much in 2022 in terms of, especially at the end of the year, in terms of like big splashy launches that would drive both the software, like the game sales, plus the hardware revenue that just like give that traditional console model the end of year boosts that they tend to see. In addition to what you were saying, David, I think it is very interesting that Microsoft is kind of betting on this, not relying on hardware as much, and being able to just go across PC and console, and really having kind of that broader reach that doesn't rely as much on hardware. So I think there's a lot of things there that are kind of working in tandem, that I think if they're successful, it's going to be very interesting, because I think we're going to see, my prediction would be this very like harsher decline on hardware revenue, but again, like retaining their subscriber base for the long run, a much more stable revenue, kind of month to month, instead of having kind of these waves that come in like at the end of the year, and just kind of stabilizing their game revenue. So I think it is it feels like they are betting pretty big on that, on cloud gaming, on potentially moving as relying as much on console sales, and like just having kind of like that close ecosystem. And they have the in, right, with like Windows, like they can put this on like in front of like so many more people than just whoever would buy an Xbox.
I actually would disagree with your first point, Tammy, on the supply chain stuff. I actually think at this point, these companies are largely moving past the supply chain issues. So weakness there is actually truer weakness. But I think you're 100% right on your point about they're moving beyond just kind of their own pure hardware ecosystem. Although still at this stage, having less hardware sales is a sign of losing market share, which is a result of the other point you were making about the interplay of content and hardware. And I think like that is their biggest opportunity by far, to have that interplay with their content across their entire ecosystem of their hardware, other hardware, like new business model, connecting it to the cloud, all of that kind of thing. But that also right now is their biggest problem, right? Which is that their first party content has underperformed basically everyone's expectations so far. And part of that is because, big games have been pushed back, right? Like Starfield in particular was supposed to launch last quarter. And now it's a question of if it's even going to launch in 2023 as like the biggest, next tentpole for Game Pass. Redfall is probably the next, and also got pushed from last year to it will launch this year. But even beyond that, it's sort of, everyone has seen, hey, Microsoft has acquired all of these studios. Where are all the new games coming from them? And I think some of that concern is probably overstated a bit, because games just take time to make. And as we even saw like a shadow drop of, I think it was called like Hi-Fi Rush or something like this past week. And that's not a game that's going to like make or break, Game Pass as a whole as a huge tentpole, but it still shows that like they're, coming out with new solid games that people can enjoy, but solving for like, hey, we got to get like this lineup of like the AAA games and to not just benefit Game Pass, but like in comparison to the PlayStation's ecosystem too, having those first party, more exclusive titles is what will also push hardware sales as well. And obviously, like the huge thing here too is just like the Activision deal. Like if they can pull that off, like in a snap, that solves a big chunk of those problems with Game Pass. The risk is that doesn't happen, and they'll have wasted a year and a half of chasing after this deal that didn't work, and then they'll have to, while Sony has been making moves on the side, and then they'll have to start making probably like smaller acquisitions and stuff, and it just drags out over a longer period of time, and the success is slower to come, even if the business model is interesting.
Aaron, how do they solve the problem if the counter of making the acquisition is that they can't have the exclusivity?
Well, I think it would be more because like Activision is too big, and maybe Call of Duty specifically is too big. I don't think that regulators would necessarily say no to other smaller deals in the same way that, like, they haven't said no to Sony, right? Like acquiring like a Bungie or something like that. There might be more scrutiny with more deals, but I think that Activision is just like a tier above the rest in terms of its size and impact. And so I think it's still a coin flip of whether that goes through. But yeah, the risk there is just like the the time that went into that could have been going to other things to increase the value of Game Pass and the Xbox ecosystem as a whole.
Well, I think it's a bet worth making, right? I think it's even if the regulators don't allow the deal to pan out, it's certainly worth Microsoft's time. I think I agree with everything you say, Aaron. I just sort of want to state the obvious, which is game development takes a really long time, and the Sony's success with first party is the outcome of, at this point, decades of acquisitions and smart management of the studio organization. And I think the team at Microsoft, they have I think their plan makes a lot of sense. It just takes a lot of time, and I do think I'm a little more bullish on the. I think we will see Starfield this year, and I suspect unless it really ends up being a bad game, which I think is unlikely because it's just very hard. Like at this scale, you just don't take that risk. There's the resources that Microsoft has for testing and tweaking are pretty insane. I think 2023 is going to look a lot better from a release perspective than 2022 did. And beyond that, yeah, we'll see. I agree with you. The Activision acquisition is really important to them, and I'm pretty sure that they would not be prohibited from having maybe Call of Duty has to stay cross-platform for its entire history of that franchise, but franchises wax and wane, and you're buying also into the new things that no one knows about yet too.
The only game that will make me buy an Xbox so far is Starfield. So I won't spend my consumer money until that's out.
Bold statement. The one thing I do want to emphasize on what David said is I think that these acquisitions, smart management of studios, you said it really well, David. I think it is a crucial and like pivotal point. So it's like step one is securing these acquisitions that can really bolster up the company and like the offering, but then from there it really is the smart management and integration, while also letting the teams, game dev, you said it's hard, it takes time, so you also have to let the teams do what they've already been doing well. So I think it's not only like, secure the acquisition, they'll be in a good spot, but it's like now you need to execute that very well.
And by all accounts, Xbox under Phil Spencer does a really good job of supporting and staying out of the way of their founders of the studios that they acquire. I know several of them, and people are pretty happy over there, which generally bodes well for the output.
That's very promising.
So before we move on then to the next discussion topic, a summary of the takeaways is that hardware sales are still linked to exclusive titles that attract those purchases. Video games take a really long time to make, and so Microsoft might need to make some more acquisitions to bolster that pipeline. And games are already a hits-driven business, but it sounds like with lack of time, you're either a massive hit or you're not.
We got to talk about esports. But I'm just proud that we didn't go on a regulatory rant talking about Xbox and Activision. That might be a first time, at least for me. So I'll pat myself on the back for that. But yeah, let's talk about esports. I'm going to kind of break my own rule on this one. This is probably just like an update on the state of esports. We can kind of talk about like what's working and what's not. Really, this topic was started because we've seen lots of issues in the esports world over the past couple weeks. FaZe has been facing financial difficulties after essentially a failed SPAC. Teams in the Overwatch League are suing the league for financial relief because they just haven't been successful in meeting promises of revenue. And even a company like 100 Thieves, which is about as strong as an esports company gets in terms of a strong brand and diverse revenue streams, they've been conducting layoffs. And so it all kind of raises the question of whether this is the norm or the exception. Is trouble brewing across the esports world? And as I said, this is a big topic, but I think that like the answer is a mix. Like, yes, there is trouble, but esports is not going anywhere. And there certainly can be exceptionally successful ecosystem participants. And of course, there are a ton of caveats, right? Every game is different. Many business models are at play in this field. And even every region is different too. So what we'll see in North America or Europe will just be completely different from what's going on in China, for example. But, I'll take a quick Western bent in how we approach this. And I guess the first thing to remember about esports is that it's fundamentally different from sports in two key ways. One, it's obviously digital, which means that it will always have a more digital viewership bent. It can be updated differently as a game, and it likely faces more competition as a result, since everything is accessible to everyone all the time, and barriers to entry to get started are very low, since you just need a phone or a computer or a console, right? And the second difference, whereas in physical sports, no one owns basketball or baseball or soccer or football, and instead leagues as businesses form around sports and can compete. In esports, the publisher owns the game, right? Which means not only do they set the terms and often not allow competition, but it also means esports is always secondary to the larger business of catering to the mass market of players. And esports, therefore, is more of a marketing and engagement tactic than a revenue driver, or something meant to be run as a super profitable ecosystem, which means that it plays out in different ways in different business models, right? So some publishers don't want to manage esports, so they essentially outsource it to the ESLs, MLGs of the world. Some do it, but become like Fortnite, where there are prize pools for events, but little consistency around the big stuff. Like Fortnite only hosted its World Cup once in 2019. And then there are the publishers who want to build and manage their own leagues, which have higher buy-ins and more limited spots, but theoretically come with more upside if the league succeeds. And as we've seen in many cases, especially with Activision Blizzard, with Overwatch and Call of Duty, publisher, I guess you could call it greed or overreach, and broader incentives can destroy the ROI for the teams that rely on them. And then if you look at the teams themselves, which typically are brands that cover multiple esports, we've essentially learned that just competing in esports is not a good enough business model on its own. Prize winnings are inconsistent. Ticketing is naturally lower for a digital sport. Brand partnerships are fine, but can only go so far. Talent costs have risen, and franchise leagues are hit and miss in their ability to create value for everyone in the ecosystem through things like broadcast rights or league sponsors, right? So it's no surprise that esports orgs have tried to extend their reach further. Many have brought on content creators to further build their fan base. They launch merch to various degrees, and some are trying to build new business lines in other ways. And this makes sense when you realize that successful esports orgs are basically defined by the number of fans they have times the average revenue of those fans on top of any like prize franchise winnings. But it's incredibly difficult to maximize that equation because it's very difficult to build competitive advantage when there's so many teams doing the same thing. Content as a business is tough to scale, and executing across multiple sub businesses is hard on top of just, winning, right? So it's not surprising that while a handful of orgs like 100 Thieves which is doing really interesting things, most teams are really struggling. And in short, I think like that's the way it's going to be. Esports as a whole can still grow as gaming grows. Viewership can rise, revenue across ecosystems can rise, and publishers and esports orgs can all get smarter. But managing long-lasting games is hard, and building businesses that rely on publishers is a tough place to be, and building competitive advantage when everyone is trying to do the same thing is really, really hard. So I think outsized success will be more the exception than the rule here. So anyways, that's sort of the context I wanted to set, but I'll stop talking and I'll just hand it over to hear, do you think I'm right or wrong? Or in your own eyes, like, are there other parts of this ecosystem that are broken, or are there parts that maybe don't get enough attention and actually are, quietly succeeding?
So I think I agree with a lot of what you said, Aaron. I think it is a huge part of esports is that there's not a business model that has been proven to be successful. So as what you were saying, like there's all these disparate pieces in terms of business models. A lot of the esports orgs have relied on VC funding, on crypto funding. Those two are very shaky right now, right? So, part of the trouble that we're seeing right now brewing is also driven by those market conditions. So it's very like on top of like all of the complications that you went through, there's also that part of like, if they can't monetize on the competitions themselves or, generate that revenue there, they're getting funding, that funding is drying out. And at that point we have, left revenue over like advertising, merchandising, what we see 100 Thieves do with merch and products, really selling the image of the esports players. So I think like that really jumps to the next element that you did not touch on, which I think it's crucial to talk about when we talk about esports, is that the players, is also an element. So you have the game, you have the players, and while there's some players that have been successful in like building multi-year careers, they're also in kind of like this very precarious situation where they don't get paid enough. They're overworked. They get exchanged back and forth as if it was nothing. So the conditions for them are not great. And they're one of like, if you really go into like the creator space, like they're like they could be one of the strongest brands, like one of the strongest things that you're merchandising and selling is that image of like those players or creators that you're bringing onto your team and your brand. But right now they can just be in one team one day, be in another team another day, and then be written off the next day. So I think there's so many elements there that are just like make the ecosystem very, very complex in even being able to have a repeatable business model.
Yeah, so this is what makes me quite interested in what Guild of Guardians is trying to do with esports. And so they're connecting blockchain, and they essentially created heroes for the game that are a reflection of the esports team, and they personify the people that are in the team, and they're doing an exclusive limited drop where you can buy into that. They're having merch, and then if you have a hero, you might be part of this group that gets VIP access to tournaments. And so it's creating this a revenue stream. I'm not sure about the details of how all of that is shared with the teams, but it's trying to create that revenue stream that the teams themselves can have in connection with the game. And I think apart from that, I just think that the franchise model is broken. Again, I'm not fully into it, but from everything that I've read, I just can't understand how the franchise model can become a profitable business for a team. And so the only way I see it working is if owning an esports team is like in traditional sports, someone who's extremely rich and they find it fun in managing the team. And so you're not expecting it to be profitable. You're expecting to get some fun out of it, similar to what F1 is.
I think it could work if the buy-ins and the costs associated were way down. I think the ROI is just broken with a lot of how these leagues were initially set up. But really quickly on Guild of Guardians, and I want to hear David's thoughts on all of this too. What's interesting to me about that is like what they're doing isn't esports, right? Like it's esports teams just using their brand for something that has nothing to do with esports, right? Which is kind of what I was saying. Like you build up your fans and then you increase, like the average revenue per fan by like pointing them in all of these different ways. And this is just like yet another one of those ways that, esports teams are just trying to capitalize on like having an audience, right? And I think it could be interesting. There's still like, maybe it'll be good for the esports teams and be good for Guild of Guardians, and maybe we'll see similar things be replicated elsewhere. But it's not esports, right? And so I think like that, says a lot too. Just like in order to thrive, they just have to point people in more directions, and they're just kind of scrambling to figure out which directions are the best and most sustainable. But anyways, David, curious to hear your thoughts on all this.
So that like Twitter meme that talking about like X was a zero interest rate phenomenon?
Yes.
I'm sort of I feel like I'm being slightly facetious, but I sort of feel like esports was a zero interest rate phenomenon, which is really a snarky way of saying that I think your comments about the fundamental challenges of the business model have never been solved, and that was easier to paper over in a time of easy money, and a lot of money went into in some ways analogous to Web3. A lot of money flowed into the space, including some from traditional sports, I think. And to your point, as a business model, I sort of one of my frameworks for thinking about this stuff is the sort of 7 powers framework, which is really a way of talking about sustainable competitive advantage. And none of these organizations have that. You could argue that some have powerful brands, and I think the best of them do, but I think there are real limits. And as you say, in esports, you serve at the pleasure of the king, which is the publisher, and they are always going to do, understandably, what is in the long-term best interests of the game. And if there are big new opportunities to capture, then they are going to take the lion's share of the value. And I think I have yet to see a model that justified the valuations that some of these companies were seeing and the money that was flowing into them. And I think until that changes, it's going to be really hard.
I think you're 100% right about so much of esports being a zero interest rate phenomenon. That's a really good way to put it. But I guess I want to kind of segue this to just a final question to what, building on what you were just saying about the publisher incentive to do its best for the game. If you are a publisher or a developer making a game that wants to tackle esports, I think we've seen a lot of examples of different ways you could go down, how hands-on or hands-off you want to be, or how you want to structure going the franchise route or not. But I'm curious just to hear your takes on what have we learned, and if you were going to launch like your own as a game builder, going to launch into esports, how would you think about it, or like what would you do differently based on now what we know from the past?
Games are built to make money through their players. You get to the market, especially if it's a free to pay monetization, subscription monetization, you're building the game for them. And what I've seen is that currently the games that are being used mostly for esports, or games that use esports as marketing, they're not actually built and balanced and supported to build a sustainable long-term esports game. And until we've seen a company that is their sole primary reason for developing this game, and that's how they treat maintaining it, even how you release and how you update the patches and how you do the balancing of the meta and the weapons, for example. I think if I were to do a company that's I'm trying to build a game that its sole focus is to create a profitable esports, that's where I'd start.
I agree with that take, and I think we are going to see if 100 Thieves actually delivers on that, because they are building a game with content creators, and in theory, with kind of that mentality as a foundation. You know, proof is in the execution, if it actually puts that as the intent, like primary intent and the primary pillar of the game, or if it, we go back to, we're just going to throw our known monetization, like player monetization playbooks at the game, and we, end up with like some slight variation, that it's going to run into the same problems as all the games that are being used for esports right now.
Cool. I would just add that I think what we learned from Activision Blizzard is to maybe just be less greedy and to treat esports less as like a revenue driver, and to maybe recognize that it's okay to actually be more of a cost center or more of a break-even center, because the value that you can get from esports more is about just building long-term engagement with people, right? And if anything, you want to design the economics of your league to be beneficial for all of the people in it, so that they are incentivized to build as much as they can around it. Building awesome content around what they're doing, trying to build engagement with their fans as much as possible to point people in this direction. And I don't actually think that the franchise model is necessarily broken in and of itself. I just think that if you were to take it more in a different direction that focused more on like win-wins from day one, for all stakeholders across the ecosystem, if anything, making it a bigger win for the other stakeholders, that's more the model that would bring you longer term, bigger success just through higher engagement of players, spending more and paying more attention for a much longer period of time.
I think that's really well said, Aaron. I mean, I completely agree with you. Like, esports games that can be esports are all forever games, and they all live within this acquisition, retention, monetization framework. And it seems to me that a really well-run, robust esports scene around your game is of its biggest use in the retention and engagement bucket, more than a direct trying to over monetize it. I think that's really well said. I think what 100 Thieves is doing with the building and actually building a game is a really bold move, and it's clearly they've seen the writing on the wall as much as anyone else, and it's a really bold attempt to create some real leverage for their business. And I'm excited to see what they do. It's making games is hard, especially when you don't have that in your DNA as an organization to start with, but there's some good folks over there, so I wish them all the best on that.
Yeah, and just to close, I think Rocket League is also doing, they haven't gotten in the way too much, and you see like a very positive, community. Just to what you're saying, David, of like the community around the game, the competitions, the esports, like it is a very positive community, and you have even teams like Moist that they talk about it very openly, lose 6 figures a month as an organization, but they're okay burning money. That's it's part of what they're doing as part of just continue on really elevating esports, because they care about elevating esports.
Another example is PUBG Mobile with their grassroots championships. Okay, shall we move in then to Playtika? Any wrap-up comments?
No, that's
Yeah.
it. Let's move over.
Let's do it. Okay, so a quick recap of last week's discussion. We're looking at Playtika's proposal to acquire Rovio. We reached the conclusion that they made such a move because Playtika has an aging portfolio and they're struggling to develop new games to rejuvenate it. Rovio is a stable, consistent, and healthy performing company that would bring stability to Playtika, but even more importantly, it will bring a new games pipeline that Rovio has established into their portfolio because Playtika desperately needs it. And then the day after we had the discussion, there was an announcement about Playtika integrating Web3 into Slotomania, which is their second best performing game. And I thought that was really interesting. I wanted to dive into it. So it could help them resolve this problem of their aging portfolio by adding a new revenue stream and also extending the life cycle of their existing games. So the way that they're doing the integration is working with a company called Recur. I struggle to pronounce it. That is focused on building a Web3 platform, backend tools, so that companies can just plug and play and focus on what they do best, which in this case is making games, and not having to take care of all the technology of Web3. And something that I found extremely interesting is that nowhere do you read NFT, crypto, Ethereum. There's no mention of it. It's about collecting symbols, collecting your slots, and building these challenges and trading and buying the symbols that you need. Because the higher rarity the symbols you have, the higher rarity the slots machine you're going to build. And then the rewards of completing these challenges is that you actually earn soft and hard currency to then use within Slotomania, and is based on how many players engage with your slots. So I assume, you want to engage the higher rarity ones because they will give you more rewards. And they're also doing an integration with physical rewards of completing these challenges. For example, getting merch, getting invitations to exclusive events, and they have some other things under wraps. So I wanted to get your take on, considering how they're approaching the integration of Web3 with Slotomania, what are your thoughts on the risks of doing that with your second best portfolio game? And do you think it's going to work?
Do you know what Recur is built on? Maybe before we answer that, like I'm just wondering because I didn't see it. Is it actually blockchain based?
So I actually read through Recur's website, and they make mention about being ready for multiple chains and being very agnostic. It does mention it's a Web3 experience. So the Recur product itself doesn't talk that much about blockchain and crypto, which could be their marketing positioning. I believe it's blockchain, but I don't see specifics about what it's built on and how it works, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. I just thought it was interesting that they, they don't use the lingo, and I guess that's just knowing their audience. And in many ways, is probably the way it should be. A lot of the lingo and tech, just fades into the background, and the players can benefit from whatever the use cases and in-game benefits are. So that makes sense. I'll just give my really quick take. I'm curious what others think because I don't really know. To me, I think the risk is somewhat mitigated because the implementation is more subtle than what we've seen elsewhere. And Playtika isn't leaning into play to earn or a heavily tokenized economy. It seems like it's embedding NFTs. It's not calling NFTs kind of into the experience. And so kind of through that, it seems to be more of just like an ARPU play more than anything. Because we know, especially after last week's roundtable, that Playtika has struggled in many ways to find new games or even acquire successfully. So it makes sense to maybe double down on what's already working and to try to get even more out of it. But instead of just kind of squeezing players even more through the existing systems, maybe adding like a new economic layer on top of that is a way to untap something new. And this could be a way to do that. I don't know exactly how it'll work in this case. And I don't know if it'll translate to other games because I also read that they said, quote, 4 games with Web3 experiences will launch by the end of the year. So they're thinking about this beyond even just Slotomania as like a full company strategy that will probably extend beyond casino too. So I don't know where to take that, but it's very interesting. And I think the subtleness is something that I'm more encouraged by. than, creating like a full ecosystem token or something like that. But I don't know. I'm curious to see how it plays out.
And we see the industry of Web3 gaming converging on this point. Immutable announced on Wednesday of their passport, which makes it seamless. You sign up with your social login. So hiding that whole layer and the steps of being a blockchain game is where it's going to be. And I'm more bullish about Playtika's strategy here because especially if they leverage their existing social casino portfolio and looking at Slotomania's KPIs, the revenue has just been on steady decline. And so being able to go back to, I believe it was an estimated 600K active users that are already accustomed to casinos, the usage of real money and not just buying and earning the currency in game. No mention of crypto is just a different way for you to engage with an existing game by having a trading mechanic that uses USD. But as you said, we'll have to wait and see of how it plays out. I'm extremely curious to see what the uptake is going to be of the, let's call them Web 2 gamers, of utilizing a Web 3 gaming design without it being obvious of what it is. Okay, well, we're going to wrap up the episode there. David, Aaron, Tammy, thank you so much for joining today. It's always nice to have you on. If you enjoyed today's episode, you can help us reach others by subscribing, leave a comment. We always love hearing from you. You can also sign up to the Naavik Digest newsletter, and you can listen to our other podcast content with our industry leader interviews and the Crypto Corner. Thank you so much, everyone, and we'll see you next week.